Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another video on History Value podcast. Today I'm joined by Professor Amy Jo Levine, and today we'll be discussing a bit about post-supersessionist theology and also the Book of Revelation. First of all, thank you for joining me today, Amy.
Always happy to be with you. Please call me AJ.
AJ, okay. Can you tell everybody what post-supersessionist theology is? What is that?
Supersessionism is a bit of a mouthful. The idea of supersessionism, which comes in different forms, is generally known as replacement theology. And it's the sense that all the promises that were given to the Jewish people, the descendants, according to the flesh, as Paul would put it, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all those promises go over to the followers of Jesus in the increasingly Gentile church. So supersessionism, replacement theology, means that the Jews are superseded by the followers of Jesus. And if we thought we were still under covenant, we Jews, not so much anymore, because it's all now with the Jesus folks. Supersessionism, however, comes in different forms. So the theologian David Novak from the University of Toronto talks about hard supersessionism, replacement theology. Christians get everything, Jews have, to use the Yiddish term, bupkis, nothing. But there's also soft supersessionism, which has the sense that, yes, the Jews are still under covenant with God because God doesn't break divine promises. So we're still under covenant, but really Jesus is the fulfillment of all of those promises. And at the end, as Paul would have it, when all Israel is saved, that means all Israel at some point will come to the belief in Christ. So the Society for Post-Supersessionist Theology is interested in how we read the New Testament, in effect, without disenfranchising the Jews.
So what happens to the Book of Revelation once one reads it in that lens, after reading it from the post-supersessionist point of view?
Well, here in San Diego at the Society for Biblical Literature meetings, we just had a whole program on reading Revelation from a post-supersessionist perspective. And for those of you who are interested in that, I would recommend a book by Ralph Corner. It's a post-supersessionist reading of the Book of Revelation. And the program was an assessment of his book. So what Ralph is interested in doing is saying, well, how do we understand the problematic passages in the Book of Revelation? John twice in Revelation mentions something called a synagogue of Satan, those who say they are Jews and are not. And Ralph, along with a number of other commentators on the Book of Revelation, for the Jewish Annotated New Testament, this would be David Frankfurter, make the argument that we should take John at his word. When he says they say they're Jews, but they're not Jews. They're Gentiles who may be adopting certain Jewish customs like dietary regulations or maybe even circumcision, or they may be Gentiles who think of themselves as true Jews, because if we look at Paul's letter to the Romans, the true Jew for Paul is one who is internally a Jew, in other words, who worships the God of Israel appropriately and follows the commandments, and not one who's necessarily mocked on the flesh by circumcision. So Ralph Corner makes, I think, the compelling argument that we take John at his word. The synagogue of Satan, they're not Jews. This I'm happy with. He also looks at the so-called 144,000 virgins who have not known a woman, who represent the 12 tribes of Israel. So that certainly looks like Jews to me, although this leaves me out. I'm not a man and I'm not a virgin, so I'm not part of this. That may be too much information. But this is a sense that these may be Jews who, prior to the coming of Jesus, were already sealed, connected with the family of Abraham, who, according to Paul, is justified by faith prior to circumcision. I'm not so convinced about that one. And there are other passages in Revelation where could there be non-Jesus following Jews who, at the end of time, get with the program, but are nevertheless sealed and protected. Corner argues that the New Jerusalem that descends from heaven, like a bride for the Lamb, is actually a Jewish city. And one of the questions I asked him in this meeting is, what makes it Jewish? There's no sun or moon, so there's no Sabbath, there's no Rosh Chodesh, there's no weekly or monthly celebration. Everybody seems to be a virgin, so there are no more circumcisions, there are no more marriages. There are Gentiles in this city, so it's a mixed multitude. So what specifically makes it Jewish? And even though Jerusalem was originally a Jewish city, that would be like saying places in Massachusetts were originally Wampanoag, and they still have the indigenous names, but that doesn't make them Native American cities. So we had a very interesting discussion about what actually constitutes something as Jewish And if John loves all things that are Jewish, and John, who wrote Revelation, loves all things Jewish, citations from the scriptures of Israel over and over and over again, does that necessarily mean that John loves Jews who are not Jesus followers? And that remains part of the difficulty of trying to do a post-supersessionist reading of the New Testament. If everything is through the Christ, then in what sense is it not supersessionist?
Now I want to take us into a different direction, but still related to the book of Revelation. So the book of Revelation claims to be written by John of Patmos.
Well, John who's on Patmos.
John
Whether
who's
he's
on
from Patmos is another question.
Right, that's what I meant. But, so John, who is on Patmos.
Yeah.
Do scholars accept that identification of the author? Do they take that seriously, or do they question that identification?
Scholars will go in a variety of different directions, so it becomes impossible to say all scholars think. But the vast majority of scholars whose work with whom I am familiar, which is actually a fair amount because I spent a lot of time in the Revelation playground, take him as his word. His name is John. Now, what does this tell us? Not much. It's a fairly common Jewish name at the time. Some people have suggested maybe it's John the Baptist. I don't think so. Some people suggest it's John, the son of Zebedee. Could be, maybe not, don't think so. Or it could just be some guy named John. So he's a guy named John. He's probably a Jew. He's seeped in the scriptures of Israel. I mean, he never quotes anything directly, but there are allusions all over the place. He seems to work out of a Jewish worldview. The problem comes when we try to determine what is the audience to which he is addressing. So one can be a Jew and write to a predominantly Gentile audience. Paul would be the perfect example here. Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles. John says at the beginning of Revelation, he's sending letters to these 7 churches, but they're very, very vague, and it's hard to tell exactly who belongs to those churches, or even whether those letters are real letters, as opposed to a literary conceit. A biblical scholar named David Frankfurter has just recently made the argument that the letters aren't really actual letters at all. But what John is doing is imitating Paul and saying, okay, you folks, you've got a collection of Paul's letters to the Thessalonians, to the Romans, to the Galatians. Well, I'm going to write letters too, because that's an authoritative genre. But I'm going to write letters that disagree with Paul. Paul says you can eat meat offered to idols as long as you know they're not gods and you're not screwing up a weaker member of your congregation. Go ahead, chow down. This guy says absolutely not. Paul's mixed marriages, a Jesus believer, and it's okay. You know, and you might actually bring that this guy and John, absolutely not. So are there actual letters that he's writing, or is this just a literary conceit? And even if we determine that John is a Jew, highly likely, doesn't tell us anything about John's audience.
So was the book of Revelation written by the same person that wrote the Gospel of John? Don't
think so. The Greek is substantially different. John is beautifully written. That beautiful hymn at the beginning, in the beginning was the Word. It's got Platonic ideas to it. It's got Aristotelian ideas. It's highly sophisticated in terms of Greek language. And pretty much if you take a course in New Testament Greek and you get to the book of Revelation, the professor will get up and say, this is not great Greek, and it's not great Greek. So people have made the argument that it must be the same person. These are arguments that usually come from a more conservative Christian perspective, and that maybe John wrote all of them, but the author had help writing the Gospels, or the author had help writing the 3 Johannine epistles. I don't think so. Do they represent the same general thought patterns? Yes, in terms of plays of light and darkness, in terms of sealing. So there's a similar cultural connection or thought school running from the book of Revelation to the 3 letters to the Gospel of John, or vice versa, from John to the letters to Revelation, because we don't know in what order these texts were written. But they do share some sort of cultural similarity.
Do they also share some theological similarities? Are there certain things that Revelation and John agree with each other on?
They certainly believe that Jesus is Lord of the world. They believe that Jesus is the Lamb of God. So at the beginning of the Gospel of John, entwined in the prologue, we have the statements of John the Baptist, things like, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And then when we get to the book of Revelation, we have the slain Lamb who conquers. So we have similar imagery back and forth. part of the problem of making the connections is that the Gospel of John is a narrative about Jesus' life. And the book of Revelation is an apocalypse. It's not a narrative. It's bizarre images. I mean, John has a few peculiar images like I am the bread of life or I am the true vine. But we can still work with those theologically. What John does is throw us into this entire new world of bizarre visions that are not interpreted, that we have to figure out what they mean, and they tumble one upon the other. So reading the book of Revelation, reading a good apocalypse, is like sensory overload. John is moving us in that direction by saying, well, if you think about bread, but now it's infused bread. If you think about wind, that could be the Spirit of God. If you think about running water, that could also be living water. And the book of Revelation takes this idea of multivalence of language and explodes the whole thing because it's a different literary genre.
So what made the early church fathers think that John and Revelation were written by the same person? Now, I know that not all the church fathers necessarily agreed on that, and they had different reasons for thinking the same thing or different things. So what do you think caused at least some of them to think it was the same John?
In part because we have similar language running all the way through. So this sort of Johannine sense, and as I mentioned about playing with language of light and dark, for example, forms of dualism. John's somewhat more mystical take compared to Matthew, Mark, and Luke seems to move us off into the book of Revelation. And people in the early, they abhor vacuums, so we want to know who wrote stuff. So you want to know who wrote the epistle to the Hebrews, as Origen put it, God knows, which I think he inflected God knows. So because there's enough connection among the three letters of John, the epistles of John, the Gospel, and Revelation, well, why not put it all together? So, and that becomes easier to interpret.
Do you think the book of Revelation is familiar with the other four Gospels, all four of them, or is it not clear?
It's not clear. And it's a good question. Part of the problem is we don't know when it was written, and biblical scholars are debating that. So there are some scholars who think that the book of Revelation was written even prior to the destruction of the temple while the war was going on, and that would heighten apocalyptic concerns. I mean, this must be the end of the world. The Romans are attacking. Clearly God will come in and fix things now. Traditionally, the book of Revelation is dated to the time of Domitian, the Emperor Domitian. So now we're talking about the 90s. With the idea that Domitian wanted to be called Lord and God. So what's this rivalry between the kingdom of Satan, which is Rome, the whore of Babylon, and all these other very problematic images, and the kingdom of God, or the rule of the Christ versus the rule of Rome? So we actually don't know when it was written, and complicating it even more, because biblical scholars don't want to complicate things. It's possible that just as people have argued that the Gospel of John was written in stages, it's also possible that the book of Revelation was written in stages, so part of it may date early and part of it may date late. We simply do not know.
So they hypothesize different versions of Revelation that may or may not have existed.
Sure, because we always do. We do the same thing with the Gospel of John, simply more common. So if we date Revelation to, say, the year 69 or 70, would Revelation know the Gospels? Probably not, because they probably haven't been written yet. But then there are some biblical scholars who want to make the Gospels really early. So the upshot is we do not know. It's clear John knows the scriptures of Israel in the Greek form, in the Septuagint. Does John know the Gospels? I don't know. So when John talks about the fall of Satan from heaven, this is Revelation 12, like the woman clothed with the stars, right? Is that reflecting Jesus' statement, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven? Could be. But even if it is, could that statement have been known apart from the gospel context? Could that be relative to other apocalyptic texts in the first century, like First Enoch, where we also have a sense of fallen angels? It's really hard to determine which Christian text knew which other, Christian using the broad term, knew which other, which is why we have debates over did the author of Revelation know the Gospel of John? Did the author of the Gospel of John know the book of Revelation? You can argue it either way.
Do you have your own conclusion about what you think may be going on with Revelation? Do you personally think that he knows those Gospels?
I don't have a horse in that race, and I'm not sure it would make a huge amount of difference. So one of the questions that I try to ask myself is, because I ask questions just like that, and I think, what difference would it make if I knew? And I can't figure out what that difference would be. So let's say John does know Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Then John is adding on to that material. There's no correction there as far as I can tell. Is John ramping up eschatological concern? Ramping up, yeah, the end of the world really is coming. You people reading Luke who think you've got to go build a church and all that's really here. Could be. But I don't need the Gospel of Luke's de-eschatologizing in order to get me John. Or is John writing over against the Gospel, which has what scholars will sometimes call realized eschatology, as if all those benefits or debits for damnation or salvation, that's already in as soon as you make your choice for Jesus. Once you believe, you're already somehow saved, in the right camp, whatever. And John is saying, well, there's this stuff in the future that's really important too. But John could say that without the Gospel.
Now I want to shift to the Gospel of John. And we've discussed this in the past, but I want to go back and recap. What convinced you that the Gospel of John likely knew Mark, Matthew, and Luke?
In part, and here I want to give a shout out to my former student, James Barker, who wrote a dissertation on John's knowledge of Matthew. And when he first proposed that, I went, oh, Jimmy, that's not going to work. And he said, well, let me give it a try. And I thought, okay, one should encourage one's students. And he came in with a proposal, and I looked at what he came up with and went, I never thought about that. I never thought about that. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I said, go, write this. And then he published, and it's great. Now he has tenure. Good. So part of it is my openness to my students. So I changed my mind on, did John know the Synoptic Gospels, in the same way that when I wrote my commentary on Luke, I originally thought that there was a source called Q, which was separate material common to Matthew and Luke that's not in Mark, this source that we don't have, by the way. But the more I was looking at Luke in relation to Matthew, the more I think Luke knows Matthew. So I've now betrayed my dissertation advisor, my Dr. Vater, may he rest in peace, a fellow named D. Moody Smith, who taught at Duke, who made his career on the independence of John and the Synoptics, and I'm really sorry about that. Part of the question that I had originally was, could I imagine John sitting at a desk with a copy of Matthew here and a copy of Mark here and a copy of Luke here, going back and forth, and is that the way actually people wrote back then? But as Jimmy Barker pointed out, that's how we get books like the Proto-Evangelium of James, or that's how we get Tatian's Diatessaron. Second century texts, third century texts, that clearly know all three Gospels, all three Synoptics, and they're changing. So the Proto-Evangelium of James is a story about the birth of Jesus and the early history of Mary and Joseph before the conception and birth of Jesus. And there's a little bit from Matthew over here, and there's a little bit from Luke over here, as if the author has both texts and is working back and forth between them. Tatian's Diatessaron, through 4:1, is an attempt to harmonize all four Gospels, which means Tatian has to have all four Gospels in order to harmonize them. Why couldn't John be doing the same thing with Matthew, Mark, and Luke? And what I think is helpful here is that I think John is engaging in some sort of spin control. And this part I appreciate. So if we just read Luke, for example, we would think that Mary and Martha never talked to each other. And by the time we get up to the Gospel of John, they are best friends and they work together. At one point in John, at the raising of Lazarus, I love this verse, Martha's talking with Jesus. They have a chat. And then Martha goes back to get Mary, who's in the house, being comforted by the Jews. It's a nice line. And says, the teacher is calling you. He's not. I mean, he may have, but it never made the text, as if to say, okay, Mary, it's okay. You can go talk with him. According to the Gospel of Matthew, at the beginning of chapter 10, the mission discourse, Jesus says to the disciples, don't go to the Samaritans, don't go to the Gentiles. So what happens in the Gospel of John chapter 4? The disciples are out buying lunch, and that's when Jesus has a conversation with the Samaritan woman at the well, and it's not the disciples who evangelize the Samaritans. They're off scene. It's Jesus himself doing that. So we have hints of Matthew, Mark, and Luke coming through in the Gospel of John, but a little bit of spin control, so we don't wind up having contradictions, but more fulfillment material. In Matthew, we have Peter being given the keys of the kingdom, and what you bind on earth is bound in heaven and all that. And John spins that out in terms of repentance and forgiveness. So the more I looked at Jimmy's dissertation, the more I looked at the broader conception of, does John know this material? I thought, yeah, I think John knows this material, and not in some pre-gospel form, but actually in Matthew as we more or less have it today. John knows that, and John is saying, okay, these are okay, but you might want to read my gospel alongside. which is actually more generous than Luke, who says, other people have tried to write this thing, but I'm going to give it to you accurately and in order, which suggests that Luke wasn't too thrilled with Mark, and maybe Matthew.
So now that we talked about chucking away the idea that John's independent of the synoptics and also the Q source too, that's gone with the wind. I kind of want to tackle that same thing on a similar trajectory regarding Revelation.
Yeah.
If we reject most hypothetical sources, why not reject the hypothetical versions of Revelation that we have no proof existed?
I'm happy to do that. Just as I'm happy to chuck the various layers of the Gospel of John for which we have no proof. Although I am pretty sure that chapter 1 of the Gospel of John is an appendix, because chapter 20 just ends, and then suddenly we have Jesus having breakfast with the disciples. I think that's an addition. I think for the Gospel of Mark, Mark ends at 8, chapter 16, verse 8, and then we add on some stuff. But there we've got manuscript evidence.
You said John chapter 1. Did you mean John chapter 21?
Oh, sorry, yes, John chapter 21, sorry.
And isn't there a manuscript that was found of the Gospel of John where it's missing chapter 21? It's late, but I heard it was 4th century.
That's possible, but I am not a text critic. So we'll let go interview a text critic on that.
Do you have an opinion on when the book of Revelation dates, or you don't really have a horse in that race either?
I have seen good arguments for both dating it to 69 and good arguments for dating it to 90. Right. So then the next question becomes, what difference does it make? Right. Here's always what difference does it make depending upon when we date it? The question about what exactly Domitian demanded, that's actually up for grabs. The texts are not quite as clear as we might think they are, the external Roman texts. We have a lot of church history, things coming from Irenaeus and people like that. But, we're talking 60 years before, or maybe 100 years before. So we actually don't know. I don't know, and I'm not sure what difference it makes, other than does John know the gospel, does the gospel know John? And those arguments can go either way. For me, when interpreting Revelation, I try to begin with the text and then work out, rather than a hypothetical date and work in. And it makes me very nervous when people determine, here's the date, here's the setting, and then we interpret the text on the basis of the date and the setting, which we've determined on the basis of the text. And that's just a circular argument. So when I read the text, I'm trying to figure out what John is attempting to convey. And the message I get is more or less the same, even if John is writing in the year 69 or John is writing in the year 92.
Do you think the evidence is more clear with the Gospel of John, that it's the Messianic era or even later than that?
And even when people want to make arguments that we've got an early papyrus fragment that may date to the early 100s or something, even that is called into question because we don't have enough stuff to compare it with, and the papyrus fragment is simply too small to do much with. So we're really more or less hampered in terms of when we date these texts, or where we think they were written, or to whom we think they were written. And biblical scholars will continue to duke this out. And at the end of the day, I want to know what difference it makes. Does it make a difference if you want to claim that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are, or at least Matthew and John are disciples? Then it has to be relatively early, because if we're going to date this thing 100, then the disciples, they have to be like 120. So from a theological perspective, if you want to claim apostolic authorship, it makes a difference. I'm not carrying that theological concern, so that doesn't matter to me.
So assuming that there is no Q source, did Matthew create the double tradition, or did he, or do you think Matthew knew someone who might have known Jesus and told him at least some of the things Jesus said? Like, what do you think about that?
Yeah. So the way you phrased the question, I've only got two options: either Matthew made it up or Matthew knew somebody. There are multiple other options in there that you might want to consider. Both. Yeah, but also there's oral tradition. There are storytellers. There are people who knew people. There may be fragments of something. There may be catenae of miracle stories. There may be logia of Jesus' greatest hits that we would have from, say, the Dead Sea Scrolls, where you have sayings of the teacher of righteousness. So there are plenty of options for where Matthew would have gotten stuff. I don't think Matthew made the whole thing up to court. I do think Matthew had a copy of Mark, and I think Matthew added to Mark. So Mark has a number of parables that end with judgment. Matthew ratchets up the judgment. Things are more hellish in Matthew than they are in Mark. So, written sources, possibly. Does it have to be Q? Okay. If I eliminate Q, then I have one fewer source, which is a good Occam's razor sort of thing. Why invent a source if you don't need one? But could Matthew have had options to lots of different sources, lots of different people, or perhaps written texts? Absolutely. And then Matthew is not just stringing pearls on the, saying, I got this saying, I've got this saying, I've got this miracle. But Matthew is also a creative writer, and Matthew's going to add to this, just as Matthew is creatively rewriting Mark in certain places to say, oh, I don't like this saying, this doesn't make any sense. I want to expand the story of the Syrophoenician woman into the story of the Canaanite woman because it fits Matthew's agenda regarding the Gentile mission. I want to shorten some of the stories because Mark's stories are pretty long and Matthew has more to say. So I'm going to shorten the story of the Gerasene demoniac, but you know what? I'm going to make it two possessed people rather than one, so the miracle is better. And I'm going to change the location to put it by the sea, because Gadara, which is where Mark is not quite on the seashore. So Matthew is adapting. Good for Matthew.
And in my closing question, when you say that Matthew may have known sources, that's different from saying, okay, I'm going to hypothesize exactly what that text says, which is what Q is. Like, exactly. Okay, I'm going to try to know what it says, even though I don't know what it says.
Pretty much so. So when I first started, well before you were born, back in baby Bible land, I was a true Q believer, and I actually wrote a couple of major articles on the social context of the Q source. So here's the first layer of Q, which is sapiential, it's wisdom literature. And then the second layer of Q is a bunch of apocalyptic people saying, oh, well, you didn't accept Jesus, well, damn you. And that's where we have the woes against the cities and all that. And then the third layer has some narrative, like the centurion with the sick enslaved boy. And I thought, oh, that's fascinating. And the more I thought about it, I said, well, there's no community, and now I've got layers of this community? How bizarre is that? So did Matthew have sources? I'm pretty sure Matthew did, and not just Mark. But was there an absolute Q source that we can reconstruct? No. Here I would recommend the work of Mark Goodacre in terms of doubting the Q source. And as Goodacre and many others have pointed out, there are minor agreements between Matthew and Luke in the triple tradition. So what's going on there? I just find it easier, it's simpler to work without a Q, and as you phrased it, the double tradition. I think that's a very nice way of putting it.
Well, thank you for joining me today, AJ.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.